You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello, this is Paul Washington, Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on helping companies define and fulfill their evolving role in society by providing timely and relevant insights for what's ahead in the area of corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about economic opportunity and fairness with Martin Whittaker, the founding CEO of Just Capital, an independent nonprofit that provides research, rankings, indices, and data-driven tools to empower all market participants to help build a more just economy, thereby moving the vision of stakeholder capitalism from rhetoric to reality. Well, there's a lot of focus today on companies' role in addressing environmental challenges from greenhouse gas emissions to biodiversity, and speaking out on social issues from racism to voting rights. There's been somewhat less attention to companies' role with respect to traditional economic issues. That's a bit ironic because if you think about where almost all companies can have the most direct impact by virtue of their businesses, it's often not on the environment or on social legislation. It's on the economy and issues of opportunity and fairness. It's also a sphere where companies can potentially benefit by shining a light on what they're doing. The Conference Board's Marketing and Communications Center, along with a Harris poll, recently conducted a survey of U.S. households on consumers' views on sustainability. And we found that fair wages and work conditions are actually more important to consumer buying decisions than any other environmental or social issues, which may reflect that these issues of economic fairness cut across political lines. There is no real red or blue divide, depending how you phrase it, when it comes to these issues of traditional economic opportunity and fairness. So today, we're going to talk with Martin about what companies are doing and can do regarding these important challenges relating to economic equity and opportunity. So, Martin, that was a bit of a long introduction. Sorry for that, but delighted you're here. We have about 1 minute left. No, we're better than that. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion.
Well, I'm very excited to be here. Long-term admirers of the work that you all do, and I think it's important. These topics, this issue is very, very important. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, a lot of uncertainty, certainly a lot of division that we see in the country right now. And as you just said, I think these are issues that can unite us, have united us in the past. And I think shared prosperity is something that pretty much every American that we've talked to wants. So I think this is really the issue of the day.
Thank you. We really appreciate our partnership between the Conference Board and Just Capital, and couldn't be happier than to have you here today to talk about this. So let's start off with just sort of setting a baseline. How, from your perspective at Just Capital, what would you say is the state of economic opportunity and equity today? How would you describe it?
Uneven. Economic opportunity is great for fewer and fewer people. If you look at just wages, for example, versus labor share of income having sort of essentially stagnated for a generation. Recent years, it's begun to pick up versus CEO pay, or if you divide it by, economic bracket, 1% versus the rest, you find growing inequality. So inequality is, in a literal sense, has been doing very well recently. We have a lot of it around, and that's bad economically because it essentially leaves the economy under capacity. And what's happened, I think, over the last several years is growing economic disenfranchisement of people who feel like the American dream is out of reach, out of touch. They feel cut and adrift. They feel like it's not working for them. And quite honestly, it's sort of understandable why people would feel that way, because that is what's happening in many, many households. So that's just not a good way to run a country, certainly not a good way to run a company. So I think we sort of owe it all, it's our collective self-interest to try and rethink, okay, how do we build a system, an economic system where more people feel ownership, more people feel like it's working for them, More people feel like it's a path that they can invest in, and it's a path to prosperity. When you look at surveys now of who people trust and which institutions people believe in, business is on the rise. Government, not so. Hardly surprising, right? When you look at gridlock in Washington. So I think people are looking more and more to the private sector to do more on social issues as well as economic and environmental issues. And that's happening. But I think that we have this opportunity right now, Paul, to really rethink what does that look like? How do we rebuild for the next generation?
Well, you can't have a sustainable system creating economic opportunity unless you've got buy-in from people. That whole system is under threat if there isn't a sense that the system is also fair. And frankly, as you said, we're also underproducing. We're under creating wealth and other benefits for people if there isn't some greater degree of fairness. So it's in everyone's interest to address.
I mean, look at our debt situation.
Yeah.
We need a sustained period of growth in this country akin to what happened after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need. And the international competition is greater than it's ever been. And yet inequality is greater than it's ever been. So we're not going to match the kind of growth that we need if we're not investing in our people, if we're not providing a path for opportunity for as many people in this country as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when I think of good business, when I think of good economics, and I think of what does that look like from a systemic point of view, I think you want as many people feeling bought in as you can. It gives you access to more talent. It gives you access to greater ingenuity, problem solving, and growth. And we know a lot more about what that means in terms of the environmental limits of growth and how we do that in terms of social fabric and investing in communities and investing in human capital in a business. We're way smarter on that stuff now than we were decades ago. All of that can come together, and I think it does come together. And at Just Capital, of course, we really bring it all together under this idea of the stakeholder approach.
Right. Let me ask you, before we get into some things that companies could be doing more of, what are things that companies are currently doing well? I mean, I guess so there's maybe two tiers to this question. Is there something that companies overall are doing reasonably well these days? And for the standout companies, what do you see that they're doing well that helps to lead to a more economically just and vibrant society?
So that's thank you. And I think we don't think about the positive enough these days. So it's good to talk about what they are doing well. Look, companies are doing a lot of things very well. I think they're certainly creating value for shareholders very well. Mm-hmm. They're certainly, and when we talk about how companies are beginning to step up on environmental issues, climate change, I know it's still a long way to go, but if I think about, I'm old enough to remember what that looked like 10, 20 years ago, and there's nowhere near the level of leadership and commitment that you see today in corporate environmental commitments and climate commitments. We see a lot of leadership by companies over the last 18 months on COVID-19 and how companies probably went beyond what they thought they could do in terms of looking after the health of their employees, lifting wages, extending benefits. So we saw a lot of good things happening and companies really stepping up. And I do think that's one of the reasons why companies now, and when asked, who do you trust more on social issues, the answer primarily is my employer. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of, I see companies playing a more important role and being expected to play a more important role in society. So that's sort of on the good side. And, we've also seen, at Just Capital, as you know, we track companies across the board, right? We track 1,000 companies across all the issues that Americans tell us matter most when it comes to just business behavior. So we track a lot of issues and a lot of companies. And there's a very broad spectrum of behavior and performance. Some companies are leaders on certain issues. When you look at how Verizon and AT&T, for example, have stepped up to invest in human capital, what they've done around diversity, equity, and inclusion within their companies, very, very strong. When I look at what Hewlett Packard Enterprises, I interviewed the CEO 6 months ago. We talked very clearly about their commitment to environmental leadership. Why? Because that was how they were winning contracts. So I think companies are really much more aware these days of this sort of broader lens of competitive factors that drive performance. I think where things sort of begin to sort of run into challenges and obstacles is in, okay, what do I do about it? How do I please my investors, oftentimes my shareholders, if I'm held to the market is holding me to short-term performance, and I'm trying to make a long-term case for investing in environmental or social elements of my business, it's harder for me to do that. So we run into challenges in the execution and the implementation. And I think business can and should do more. But I would say on the upside that, really to summarize, companies much more aware of what they can and should be doing, many companies leading on key issues, much broader sense of the role of business in society. And then on the flip side is action, execution. There's a big delta right now between commitments and action. And we draw attention to that in some of the work that we do at Just Capital, not in a negative way. We're trying to help companies act. So we're all about trying to accentuate the positive and show a path forward for what companies can do. But I think that's where help is needed right now. Okay, what exactly should I be doing on my workforce to address the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable workers? And as you know, we have a program focused on that. So those are the kind of things where I think we see the most sort of attention needed.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Even if companies don't necessarily articulate it this way, there has been a shift in the mindset where companies have always been concerned about having happy customers and reasonably happy employees and abiding by environmental regulations and even going a bit beyond that to do right in those areas. But it was often more with the orientation, well, we can do all these things because it will lead to increased profits for our shareholders. And so those were a little bit of the means to the end. And now companies, I think, are recognizing that that the welfare of society at large, of the natural environment, of their stakeholders, obviously beginning with their investors, but all the other stakeholders, is actually an end to work toward. And so now, okay, what do you do about it? I don't even like the cliche phrase, but is there some low-hanging fruit out there that for companies that want to take action, that want to take this commitment and turn it into action, that they can do specifically in the area of increasing economic fairness and opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's funny when we've been doing this 7 years at Just Capital now. We've spoken to probably, at least through our formal surveys, probably 120,000 people all across America, all different backgrounds and physical locations, and we divide it by race, ethnicity, gender, political affiliation. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is you actually do get quite a convergence, quite a lot of agreement around what are those issues that matter. So I don't know if this is low-hanging fruit, but the place to start is always, okay, how do we create a framework, a belief system at our company that is about value creation? And I don't mean sort of big, sort of fancy statements that don't actually mean anything. I mean, like, okay, operationally, what are we here to do? What do we believe in terms of value creation? How do we compete? And when you look at that and you look across sort of, okay, here are the key stakeholders in my business: my employees, the communities where I operate. That would include suppliers, supply chains, et cetera. My customers, of course, the planet as a whole, the environment, and then lastly, my shareholders. And I'm a well-run company. Do I reflect integrity and ethics in the way we run our business? And are we making money? And you put all of that together, and it creates a framework where I think companies can begin to say, okay, let's make sense of this, because it can be very complex. I could throw out a whole bunch of things that you might think that might work for one company, but they're not going to work for another company. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a mistake because we look for like a quick fix. We look for like some simple thing we could do. And what I always say is, let's just start with the framework. How are you thinking about your company today and what drives value and how you create value? And then you look at across each of those stakeholders, how are we doing in these areas? Where might we invest more, for example, in building a diverse workforce? Why? Because that was going to make us better and more competitive, and it's going to help us reach new customers, new audiences. How do we think about a suite of benefits that will help my employees bring their best selves to work, like bring it, be more engaged? I give you the example of PayPal, which is quite well known by now, but when we began to talk to them, it was not well known. They surveyed their workforce, and what they thought was going to be a great response, here's a wealthy company, very profitable, and they expected everybody to be feeling great and to be financially secure. And it turned out that wasn't the case. There's actually quite a few employees, mainly in their call centers, who were economically very vulnerable and unhealthy, financially unhealthy, economically. And that was a problem because Dan Schulman, the CEO, felt personally that was a problem. He doesn't want anyone at his company under distress, obviously, and not feeling like they're bringing their best selves. It was also a business problem because the productivity was down, there's more attrition, everything. So what they did, they developed a plan to lift wages, lower the cost of benefits, to provide a path to stock ownership, and then wrap the whole thing in a financial education process. And I'm actually on a working committee that advises on that. And it's really fascinating, Paul, because just knowing the state of his workforce was the trigger. Once you knew there was a problem, you could do something about it. And it wasn't some complex, it's complicated to do, but so the reaction wasn't like a massive sort of shift in the way they were doing business. It was sort of quite a series of common sense steps, but knowing was the key. And Mark Bertolini tells the same story at Aetna. So I think oftentimes begin with the framework and then just find out where you are honestly and objectively within your company on all of these key issues. And then once you benchmark yourself, then you say, okay, now we know where to focus our resources. Where are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck by investing in our workforce or the communities where we operate? Maybe Chobani is a perfect example of that. Investing in a community to really get the entire community behind a company has a tremendous, really powerful effect on business brand and sort of sense of well-being around the company. So there's lots of benefits. But each company's at a different place on that journey. But you start with the framework. You got to know where you are, and then you can develop a plan that works for you.
That's really helpful. Because if you're going to create value for all, you have to find out what people value, what they're looking for. Given where we are in the pandemic, given where we are, the economy it was roaring, and growth has slowed, obviously, because of the Delta variant. In this environment, do you see it kind of getting any easier for companies to take action in these areas to increase economic opportunity and fairness? That's
a good question. Just to go back to how you frame that, the economy was certainly roaring for some people, but but not for everybody, and we sort of lose sight of that. I think COVID, George Floyd, the economic shutdown and reopening, everything that's happened in the country has really disproportionately affected minority populations, the working poor. You see that with people not going back to work. It's very hard. The labor shortage right now is really a good job shortage, as we've written about in Just Capital. So I think all of that is caught up in that. So we should be careful about how we characterize the current situation. But do I think that it's harder? I don't see a lot of concrete leadership coming out of Washington on major policy initiatives working with big companies to solve big societal issues. I'd like to see more of that. And I'm not really a policy wonk. I don't follow it closely enough. So, it's easy for me to say things like that. But I'm a much more collaborative approach between public and private sectors to say, okay, how might we think differently about leveraging the intrinsic power of the private markets as opposed to just adding more taxes on or doing the same old thing, because the pendulum is just going to keep swinging, right? Every time it's probably going to swing with greater amplitude and velocity than it ever has done in the past, it seems. So I think this is a great opportunity for business to step up. As I said earlier, expectations of stakeholders for business to step up is very high right now. Certainly expectations of many, many investors within the sort of, let's call it the ESG world, but investors who recognize that economic, social, environmental governance issues are in their best interests for companies to figure out. So you have stakeholders or shareholders, I should say, that are giving companies much more encouragement to lead. You certainly have workers who want companies to do more. A whole generation of employees who are expecting their companies to step up and speak out and do things on social issues, which wasn't the case several years ago. So you have this perfect storm, if you will, of stakeholder expectations. Workers, investors, certainly customers are beginning to reward companies. So I think the market as a whole is sort of creating really good conditions, fertile conditions for companies to think a little bit differently and to be leaders on economic empowerment and inequality. And those things are out of self-interest too, because it was going to help a company be better. So I look at all of that and I think the scene is set, and I see fragmented leadership. I thought after the Business Roundtable shifted the purpose of a corporation, which is obviously very famous right now, right, going back to the summer of 2019, I thought we'd see more after that. And I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more concerted, orchestrated action to say, okay, what do we really mean by value creation for stakeholders? What do we really mean on this particular issue? This is a pivotal issue that we're talking about right now, economic equality or inequality and fairness. And I'd like to see business step up and do more, but I think the conditions arguably have never been better for them to do so.
Right. There's certainly an opportunity. There's certainly increased expectations, but I think you put your finger on one of the big challenges, which is it's not something that the private sector can do on its own. It needs a public-private partnership, partnership with government. And if government isn't functioning effectively, it's hard to have someone to partner with. The other thing that I think is, at least to me, strikes me as one of the challenges these days, is that we already saw before the pandemic a lot of people just opting out of the labor market. They felt alienated from the labor market, so they dropped out. In the same way, in some ways, that people sort of dropped out of the civic engagement world, right? And so you have not only disadvantaged, but also disaffected people. And the pandemic is adding to those numbers. So I think there is a real urgency here to try to reach the people who are only adding to the group who are already disenfranchised, disaffected, choose which word you want. And so that's a really mounting urgency, I think, here.
You're exactly right. That's why it's linked to democracy, because what you have is a situation where when people feel disenfranchised, it becomes a very bad situation. And so I fear for the health of democracy if we can't figure out how to create a strong, inclusive economy. And it's one of the reasons why you talked about sort of political dysfunction. It's unfortunate, but even the very subject of what sort of economy do we want, how do we build a more inclusive economy, has become political.
Yes.
It's been portrayed as being socialism by the back door. Critics on the right would say all this ESG stuff, this corporate sort of justness and corporate social responsibility is really politics. And then even the folks on the left would say, well, it doesn't actually mean anything. This is just business trying to protect itself. They're not actually solving any problems. They're not even interested in solving any problems because they're not doing this, that, or the other. And I think that sort of center ground needs to be reclaimed. And ideologically, I guess that's where I'm going with this. Is sort of, I think when you try to bring out a message where people can actually get together around, where you've got a message in the center that appeals to people who just want to get by, put food on the table for their family. They want a better tomorrow. They want a path to upward economic mobility. They want to feel as though they're treated well with dignity and respect in the workplace, all of those things. That can't be too much to ask, can it? How is that political? How is it political to provide good jobs, good benefits, fair pay, and to have workers feel like it's that they're sharing in the wealth that gets created? I just don't believe that. So I think the center ground here needs to be reclaimed a little bit. So and by the way, that goes back to the polling. I said earlier, the vast majority of Americans actually agree. When you ask them, Paul, what matters to you when it comes to business behavior? What are the things that you really care about? You're going to agree on a lot of those things because it's not it's not rocket science. So I feel like that we have the makings of that new sort of shared vision. I just don't know if we have the will at this point, or who's got the will. That concerns me. I think I see a lot of it in business, but is there a sufficient political will right now, or any political incentive, quite honestly, to really push a centrist message? It doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, to forsake partisan advantage for societal advantage. So let me ask you just two final questions. Let's say you're talking to a CEO, and you do this all the time. What's your main piece of advice that they shouldn't do? What should a CEO avoid doing when it comes to issues of economic opportunity and fairness? Like where have you seen CEOs stumble?
I think I go back to something I said earlier when you asked me what's the low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you think this can be dealt with a couple of metrics from SASB or GRI, or this is somehow solved by a new way to like one thing, like there's a panacea,
Mm-hmm.
like there's a simple thing, there's some switch we need to flip. I don't think so. I think that just kicks the can down the road. I go back to this idea of a framework. We have to think about, okay, how can I try and create an overall approach for my company that is worthy of my legacy, that is going to create value for all my stakeholders, including my shareholders, because when I retire and when I'm looking into the eyes of my grandkids, I want to feel good about myself. And I think that's not a quick fix. That's not a quick metric or some reporting thing. Like that requires hard work and effort and some honest confronting some tough questions about the your company and the business you're in, and maybe overcoming internal barriers as well.
It's a great answer, because I think it suggests don't go chasing after your ESG rankings for the sake of the rankings. Don't go chasing after, we're going to hit all these things that SASB or TCFD or GRI. So I guess, don't look at this as a quick fix, and make sure you build internal consensus around it, right? Including with your board.
Well, and to your point, like, I think that's a great point. Thank you for raising that. I think throughout your organization, there's going to be a lot of misconceptions about what you mean when you even use the word, economic inclusion, or the words economic inclusion. What does that mean? Does that mean we're all of a sudden now not trying to make money for our shareholders? Does that mean that we have to think about, as a board member now, worried about whether I'm fulfilling my fiduciary responsibility? Like, there's a lot of triggers, and you can avoid a lot of missteps if you can have some honest conversations and just clarify what it is we're talking about without using fancy language, and why this is important to our company as a collective. Get as much buy-in as you can, and create a roadmap that people can see clearly and understand clearly what it is you're doing and why you're doing it.
That's great advice too, because if you're going to try to create a society where everyone feels like they're bought into our economic and political systems, you got to do it in terminology that enables people to feel like they're buying into something, right? And you got to get people to buy in internally before you go off to do this as a company. So I think Martin, that's just terrific advice. So spend a little time making sure that everyone has a common understanding as you build that framework, as you go out to reach out to people to figure out how you can deliver greater value to them in ways that may not, as you said, require a huge change in the way you're doing business.
Yeah, the ESG world, the sustainable investing, stakeholder capitalism world has done a great job of confusing many, many people about what these terms even mean.
Yeah.
Right? It's the quote unquote alphabet soup.
Yeah.
And partly, we can talk all day long about why that is. How do we get here from there? But I think it's time to boil it down to some simple tenets of good business. And oftentimes this idea of creating value for stakeholders. I mean, how many CEOs do you know that say our greatest asset are the people who work here? Like that's a cliche.
Right.
And yet how many times do we think about what's our return on investment in our training,
Right.
in lifting wages, in providing good benefits? We don't think about it that way. We think of our workers as a cost.
Right.
And this is part of the mythology that we need to get through. It's like either I'm creating value for my shareholders or I'm looking after my workers. When did that become a narrative? Why did the market begin to punish companies for lifting up the lowest paid workers? And when you actually look at the share price, by the way, it takes a hit when those announcements have come. But then those companies come roaring back and go on a tear. So we've got to. That's the kind of thing I think that, when we talk about getting a common understanding and trying to cut through some of the mythology of this, that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
I really appreciate that. Well, that's perhaps an area where we in Just Capital can collaborate in coming up with and straightening out some of this terminology as we help companies address these issues. So Martin, thank you so much. This has been a really terrific conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone's enjoyed listening to the discussion. For everyone who is listening, you can find a number of reports relating to stakeholder capitalism, how companies can address social issues and other matters on this podcast's webpage, as well as some resources from Just Capital. And you can also find additional podcasts and webcasts and blogs on all things corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship related, the whole gosh darn alphabet soup of it, by visiting ESG News and Views at conference-board.org/blog/podcasts. Okay, for those of you who have written that down, congratulations. So thanks again, Martin. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.